that are used during the course of the investigation can be used for other purposes.
And, you know, on a point in going against the Kennedy case, which is, at this point, the strongest case I have on it is, yes, there certainly are times that statements can be used. The question is, it does cross a line at some point, and our argument is it does cross the line here to get in the specifics of what Mr. Anthony and Ms. Redden said. We had litigation, a fair amount about Ms. Redden's prior statements coming in now that she repudiated it. We had that hearing about that. I don't think that this should be able to come in for that. As far as Mr. Anthony's prior statements coming in, the fact that he made some statements about some things does not open the door to everything that he said to the police. And so the question is going to come down to how much value does this have for the interview? If they wanted to have the officer even say, we tell them that, you know, other defendants said something about it, and then that helped prompt along the interview. That would be one thing, but then to have it actually said there and spelled out to the jury what they're saying and all, it's going to be hard to unring that bell simply with a limiting instruction about it. So I think the statements go too far.
And do you have a citation for that, Kennedy?
Yes, I do. 5 NC 242.
Yes.
Is Carlos Kennedy Act, if there could be more than one.
I think that is right. It's a 2002 case, and if not...
355 NC.
355 NC 242, yes.
And I erred in one of my sites, Your Honor. It would be State versus Tucker would be 331 NC 12. And in that case, and I haven't had a chance to fully review it, but the defendant was entitled to introduce co-defendant statements because he did not offer them to prove the truth of the matter asserted, but to discredit the state's theory of the case.
What's that? I don't think so. I mean, I read it fairly carefully yesterday. Okay. But I think the gang stuff I posted there was the thing that has to do with Clay. Yeah. That's a big thing. Was the end. And I want to deal with it. It's not the case of the place. It's something like that. I'll have to do it again. Maurice, I think it's Maurice.
All right. I agree that it is not hearsay. It's not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, but rather to elicit a response by the interviewer. I've found case law that, at least from federal district courts and other jurisdictions, that state that it is not a Crawford situation because it's not hearsay. But I am concerned under Rule 403 in this case that the details provided in the narrative questions it certainly is an appropriate interrogation technique. I don't question that. I don't question the methods used by Detective Gibney, but in terms of whether the questions are admissible, the detail that's provided in the questions that are attributed to Mr. Anthony and to Ms. Redden, in my view, have an unduly prejudicial effect when balanced with the probative value. The probative value being, this was what I asked to elicit a certain response. That's the probative value of this non-hearsay testimony. But the level of detail as to what Mr. Anthony was saying, who is not subject to any cross-examination in this case, and the level of detail of what Ms. Redden would say, who is subject to cross-examination, but the impeaching the prior inconsistent statements. Both sides have avoided those prior inconsistent statements for various reasons, and I think that in light of all of these circumstances, it seems to me that the undue prejudice of allowing those narrative portions of the questions come in outweigh the probative value under Rule 403, so I will exclude those narrative portions.
Can you be specific
Yes.
about which ones
Yes.
that you mean?
So I'm going to, on page 14 was the first time we encountered this. I'm going to allow that one. I believe that that does not provide the type of detail that I'm concerned about. It simply is a statement that we've spoken with Ron and with Sarah, and they've given it up. And so I think that this on page 14 still has sufficient probative value that outweighs the any undue prejudice. So I would allow the entirety of what's found on page 14 with a limiting instruction. Then on page 15, starting with the line that says, okay, I think the entire bolded section would be excluded under Rule 403 on page 15. I don't know how precise you can be with stopping and starting this recording, but so the first three lines on page 16 would not be excluded. Starting, what would be excluded is they've already told us, and going to stopping at the word okay. Although the next sentence, and the only thing you have going for you right now is your opportunity to help yourself out or prove them wrong.
Are there a lot of okays?
Okay, I'm talking about,
The second, the third, fourth okay?
yeah, so five lines down from, so about 8 lines into that paragraph. So starting with the words, and the only thing you have going for you right now, that would be allowed, as would be the remainder of that bolded section. On page 22, the entire bolded section would be excluded. And the first 3 lines are fine. Do you agree with that? But they would be allowed if the state can, starting with the word Ron told us, that would be what's excluded. Continuing on down to the end of the bolded section. On page 28, all right. After the line, do you understand what I'm saying? Excluding the remainder of the bold portion, starting with the word "and people get like that," going to the end of the bold section.
Page 29.
Yes, the bold section through the end of page 29. The first 2 sentences, he said he didn't find nothing. He said he didn't find nothing. Those would be allowed, but then starting with the word "so," why is he telling us, through the end of the bolded section on page 33 would be excluded. All right. Anybody wish to be heard further?
On that on that last one, and I guess in general we're trying to keep up here, but I understand Your Honor's ruling on the specific statements of he said you did this. I think that's where the court's concern is. But for example, on that last one, you've got two people pointing the fingers at you, pointing the fingers at you. There's nothing specific in regards to that statement saying you took the iPhone. So I would ask that what we exclude here are specific instances of conduct, but general instances such as that one, I would ask that Your Honor allow that a statement such as that.
All right. What about I'm saying that he said there that you took a phone out of there and you threw it up in Wake Forest, smashed it.
That's before.
All right. So you're saying that should be. Wait, you're not agreeing, but you're saying that would be more consistent with my prior ruling.
Yes, sir.
All right.
And that would be through he's lying. That would be the point
Right.
where you see the shift. Is that
Right.
Mr. Waller?
Sure.
Right. Right. I agree with that's. I think that it's appropriate to have general characterizations that two of them are pointing the finger at you. That I think falls within the investigatory technique to elicit a response. What I am concerned about is the narrative of details that were obtained from interviews of others. I think that I would agree with you, Mr. Waller, that two people pointing the finger at you is more akin to what I've already allowed in on page 15, for example, or 14. All right. You wish to be heard further? So,
Is that allowed?
yeah, I would allow, so excluding, so why is he telling us that you got a phone out of there and threw it out in Wake Forest? Starting there, that would be excluded, and going down to, he's lying, would be excluded. And then the remainder of that bolded section would be allowed. Anything further, Mr. Waller?
Just in terms of, I guess, how to do this, I don't believe it's physically possible for us to fast forward and rewind that with this much specificity. So what I would ask, and I'm asking this for two reasons, is that we allow Ms. Shakita or whoever's running the computer to be able to hit mute, because I think that would be easier in terms of starting and stopping if we can do that. And two, I think his demeanor during the course of this interview is almost just as important as what he says. So one, I don't think it's possible, quite frankly, to stop and start. I mean, I'm not asking you to throw the whole statement out, but I'm asking that you allow us some leeway in terms of how we edit this statement. And along those lines, we also need a moment to look and see, one, if we can go back through and if there are some general things that we ask that you allow. Two, we need to make a decision on if we're even going to offer the statement at this point. And I know I don't want to waste this jury's time, but we can call another witness, but we're kind of, if you could allow us a few moments to discuss what we're doing.
All right.
Either back up and call another witness or stay with this witness. We just need a few moments.
All right. And do you have anything further, Mr. Brown, Ms. D?
No, sir. I mean,
We understand the court's ruling. Of course, we renew our previous objections for the record, but we do understand, and certainly, we understand that that they should be allowed to have time to do that and be willing to work, the idea of mooting it at certain times and all would not be objectionable to us, as long as the tape is done consistent with the rulings.
Right. I don't have a problem with muting it during the relevant portions. That's fine. That probably is easier to do. All right, so you need a little time.
Well, I mean, our options are we can take Detective Gibney off the stand at this point, and Ms. Shakita and I can have a conversation over lunch on how to handle it. Or we can continue, I mean, maybe 15, 20 more minutes may, go ahead.
might discuss it if they wanted to take Mr.
Giving off the stand, as long as they put him back, we would not object to not cross-examining him at this very moment.
My
And as long as
suggestion would be we either take a lunch recess early or suspend Detective Brady's testimony, Detective Gibney's testimony. I can call Detective Brady, so whatever the court prefers. I couldn't even get through several pages with the timing when you gave us the break, so it will take me some time to do this. So that would be my suggestion, either to break now for lunch, or I can put Detective Brady on in Detective Gibney's stead to get us to lunch.
All right. I'd prefer to go a little bit further just because we have the jury that's sitting. I'd prefer to go, another 45 minutes or so till we get to our normal lunch break. So without objection, we'll just inform the jury that Detective Gibney is going to stand down. We're going to proceed with another witness, and then Detective Gibney will be recalled to the stand at a later time.
You don't have an objection to that.
All right, very good. Let's bring jurors then. right, ladies and gentlemen, again, apologize for the delay, and my time estimate was was wildly off on this one, but we appreciate your patience. And again, urge you not to speculate as to what occurs in the courtroom during your absence on these matters of law that are required to be conducted outside the presence of the jury. We're actually going to, Detective Gibney has stepped down. We're going to start in on another witness, and then Detective Gibney will be recalled later on in these proceedings. So I believe we're going to ask the state whether they're going to call further evidence for the state.
Detective Brady.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear I will.
Thank you, sir. Move around us.
All right, Mr. Keating.
Please state your name, sir.
So Sean Brady.
And how are you employed?
I'm a senior detective with the Raleigh Police Department.
How long have you been with the Raleigh Police Department?
Since 2000.
And with respect to being a detective, how long have you been in investigation?
Since 2006.
In March of 2013, were you assigned to a particular unit?
The Homicide Unit 1.
And how long had you been in the homicide unit at that point?
About a year.
And are you currently with the homicide unit?
No, ma'am.
Can you tell us about where you're assigned now?
Currently, I'm assigned as a task force officer for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
And what does it mean to be a task force officer with ATF?
I kind of work along with them. I'm a liaison between the Raleigh Police Department and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms. We work investigations together, so it's basically I'll take a Raleigh police case and take it into the federal system.
I want to turn your attention again back to May 14th of 2013, specifically the investigation into Melissa Huggins-Jones' death. Do you recall where you were when you first were notified or made aware of this?
Yes, ma'am.
And where was that?
I was actually on my way into work for the day.
And what, if anything, did you hear? Well, how did you hear about it on your way into work?
I was on my way into work. I had my police radio on in my car. As I was driving in, I heard come over the radio of an unresponsive female with blood about her face.
What did you do in response?
I pretty much knew that probably wasn't very good, so I was on the Beltline at the time. I was only a few exits away from Six Forks Road, so I just proceeded there.
And what, if anything, could you see when you first got to 441 Alistair?
As soon as I pulled in, there was a few police cars there, a fire truck, an ambulance. We're already on scene.
And what did you do?
I got out of my car and I walked up the stairs. I could see where everybody was kind of congregating up on the breezeway. I walked up and inquired about what was going on.
What kind of information did you get first off when you got to the...
Are
you at the apartment now? Or
I am at the apartment. I walked up the breezeway and was up on the landing outside the victim's apartment.
Generally speaking, what were you informed at that time?
I was informed that there was a female inside that was deceased. She'd been pronounced dead by EMS. She was lying on her back, had blood all about her.
What do you do at that point now that you have that information?
At that point, since I knew that she had already EMS or fire, somebody had been inside and checked her to make sure that she wasn't alive. I told the officer that nobody was allowed back inside the house, that it was now a crime scene and nobody else needed to be inside.
Why do you do that? That is protect the scene.
Preserve evidence and try to make sure that nobody else is inside.
What were the next steps you took at that point after designating it as a crime scene?
At that point, I began calling my teammates that were on Homicide Unit 1 to let them know of what I had, give them information. I made contact with Detective Morse, let him know that we had a crime scene, and asked him to begin working on a crime scene search warrant.
When you said you started alerting the members of your team, we've heard from many of them thus far talking about how you were the case agent.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you describe that process and how you become the case agent?
There's 5 of us on the team with a sergeant. We take turns being what's called the lead detective. And basically all that means is we all work as a team in a homicide itself, but for future-wise, for organization purposes, one person becomes the lead detective. It was my turn to the next homicide that came up. It was my turn to be lead detective. That was kind of the one reason why I went straight to the crime scene, because I knew it would be mine. So it's kind of for organizational purposes, one guy is, but there's no really one true person in charge of, because there's so many different facets of an investigation. That way we all work together on it.
When you indicated that you had called Detective Morse to start off with a crime scene search warrant, had you been made aware that there was any concerns about the downstairs apartment at that time?
At that point, no.
And so now that you're talking to the other members of your team, can you tell us how your responsibilities unfold at that point?
As we were, of course, there was a lot of my command staff and everybody was there. We're trying to share as much information as possible during this, and it became. I was advised that somebody from Kane Realty was going to come and go into the downstairs apartment, which was the office, to try to get a roster of residents. We weren't 100% sure who the resident was at that point, so we were trying to see who was in that apartment, who was in the other apartments in the building. And somebody from Kane Realty arrived on scene and was escorted by an officer into the apartment downstairs, which was the leasing office at the time. As they were going through that, they quickly realized once they entered that that had been broken in as well. They immediately removed themselves from that scene, and then that became a crime scene itself. And then I made contact again with Detective Morse, advised him of that information, and another crime scene search warrant was issued.
And so at this point, are you treating the upstairs and downstairs apartments as one crime scene or two separate crime scenes?
No, they're two, just because we didn't know at that point if they were the same. I mean, you obviously probably think they are, but because of the two different locations, the two different possible victims, we kept them as two different crime scenes. I became, because of the deceased person in the crime scene upstairs, I became the lead for that, and I signed another detective for the crime scene downstairs.
Do you recall who that was downstairs?
Detective Neighbors.
Generally speaking, you talked about getting a search warrant for the different scenes at this point. What's the purpose of the search warrant?
It's just to be able to enter the home. As with anything, we don't have a victim that can give us permission to go into the home. So it's to be able to assure that we did things legally and entered the home and took anything out of there that we need legally.
Before you actually get that search warrant signed, are you milling around in either of the crime scenes, or do you actually wait until the search warrant actually has been signed and delivered?
Oh, well, there's been times that we would go in, obviously, to see what kind of crime scene we have before we get that. Obviously, there was fire, there was EMS. The officers had already been in and gave me enough information to know what we had, so I had not been in at that point.
To your knowledge, did Detective Morse obtain those search warrants
He
to
did.
allow you to go in?
Yes, ma'am.
And once those are done, can you describe what happened next?
Detective Morse got the search warrants. He brought them to me. I then took possession of those, and then we have to what's called executing the search warrant, which basically I have to go into the physical residence itself. I have to read the search warrant out loud, and it's kind of serving the search warrant on the home. It's kind of silly because there's nobody there, but it's just a way of doing it.
We've heard a little bit of testimony about CCBI. What is CCBI?
City County Bureau of Investigation.
And what are their responsibilities in terms of helping you in any sort of investigation?
They are an agency that works with the Raleigh Police Department and other departments within the county that does all our crime scene investigation. They're the ones that do the fingerprints. They're the ones that do the DNA. They process an entire crime scene for us. Raleigh Police Department does not do that on themselves. We work in conjunction with them to do the processing for us in crime scenes.
And in a case like this, obviously where you have now a deceased person, is that the type of case that you would contact someone from CCBI to come?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
Where was Hannah when you first got there to your call?
She was in the ambulance downstairs.
And at that point, had you been made aware of how the 911 call had come in and how Hannah had found construction workers?
Yes, ma'am.
So at the time initially on when you're inside, or you're at the scene waiting for the search warrant, were the construction workers still present?
Yes, they were. I believe that they were on the front of the building at the time. I think they had been taken out the front. Due to obviously them being in the crime scene, them having information, the little bit of information that I had been given through conversation from the construction worker statements, Hannah's statement, we decided to let them be taken to the Raleigh Police Department Atlantic Ave substation, which is the detective division. I wanted them to have good interviews. I wanted it away from the scene where they could relax and recall all the information correctly. So I asked that they were taken to the police department.
And you said earlier that you're working in conjunction with the team. Are other members then of the investigative division talking to the potential witnesses?
Yes, I knew that there was detectives at the detective division waiting for them to arrive.
And at the point where the search warrants are, you said, served on the apartments, do you begin the investigation in there, or tell us what happens?
Usually at that point, we wait for the CBI to arrive, which they had at some point. I'd notified them that the search warrants were executed on the home. They need that to be able to enter themselves. And then we did go in and view the crime scene and figure out what kind of investigative things we needed to do inside, looked for evidence, and then began the processing procedures.
And so when you first go into the building, is it with CCBI once the search warrants are there?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you describe, for example, the upstairs apartment as you initially found it?
As we go in, you go into the front door. It's a little hallway as you first enter the home. Off to the right is a couple of doors. I believe there was some equipment room, and then there was like a pantry. As you kind of go off to your right, you go into a little dining area, which goes into a kitchen. As you go into that, through that hallway to your left is the living room. Big open living room with a sliding glass door at the other wall. If you go into the living room and you take a left, you go into another little hallway area. To the right is a bedroom, which was Hannah's bedroom. To the left is a bathroom, a small bathroom. Come back around into the living room, go back into the kitchen. If I was walking from the front door, went through that hallway, through the kitchen, you go into a doorway where you can see a bathroom in front of you. There's a little hallway inside that doorway. To your right is a closet, and to the left was the victim's bedroom.
And as you're entering initially into the apartment itself, just from the front door, for example, did there appear to be any being unusual when you first entered?
As we first entered and got into what would be considered like a little dining room area, a little kitchenette area, you could see that there was a purse that was laying on top of the table. It looked like maybe it had been turned upside down. There were some items on the floor, some items on the table. As you go into the kitchen area, there was some pill bottles or vitamins that were on the counter. One of the cabinet doors was open, and then there also is another little, I think it was the washer and dryer room, that the door was open.
And then as you go closer to Melissa's room, can you describe what you saw as you approached that?
As you walk through that the kitchen area, living room area, and you enter that doorway that goes into the hall towards her bedroom, the door was about halfway open. There was a pen that was stuck up underneath the door. Like if you were to open a door and the pen was underneath, it would catch it. And there was a kind of a purse or a cloth bag that was laying just outside the bathroom that had a Bible in it, and the Bible was kind of pulled out, and there was some other, I think, various paperwork that was kind of laying out as if it had been gone through.
Specifically, entering into Melissa's room, can you describe what you saw initially?
If you turn into the bedroom area, the room kind of, the wall is straight there, so it kind of breaks off to the right a little bit. As you go in, you can obviously see the victim laying on her back. She's on the right side. If you're looking from the foot of the bed to the front of the bed, she's laying on her back towards the right side of the bed. Her left leg is completely off. Her right leg is on the bed, but her foot's kind of hanging off the bed. Obvious blood all about her. She's got a pillow on her chest. There's a white cord that's coming from the head of the bed that comes up towards her head. You can see on the wall as you first come in what appears to be blood, maybe a smear mark. It's kind of rubbed on the side of the wall. There is a small bureau, looks like a jewelry box, kind of a taller jewelry box. Cabinet drawers were open. One cabinet was, I think, pulled all the way out, was laying on the floor. Appeared to be some blood on that. At the foot of the bed were pillows and blankets. Appeared to have blood on those. As you turn right to go around the bed, it's a very short area between the end of the bed and the wall. Appeared to be blood on that wall. You walk up to a dresser, and there's a very small space between the dresser and the bedpost. Some of the dresser drawers were not all the way flush. As you turn around that corner, there's windows there with blinds. The blinds were kind of pulled away from the wall. You know, the slats weren't all equal. Some of them were raised, and one of them was actually broken off. There was some plastic bins on the floor under the window, and then there was an end table, kind of same thing. There was drawers that weren't flush, as if they had been open or not all the way closed. On the headboard itself, there was blood. On the blinds, there was windows behind the headboard. On the blinds, there were blood, or what appears to be blood. And on the ceiling above the victim, there was what appeared to be blood.
And as you're seeing this, is the agent from CCBI also?
Correct.
To your knowledge, did she make, is it a he or she?
Is she.
Okay. Did she make efforts to document?
And there was two, but there was the lead agent was she, but there also was the supervisor there that was a he. So just want to make that clear.
Is it your responsibility to take photographs, or is that something CCBI would do?
CCBI.
After walking through this scene and noticing, you said you wanted to walk through to figure out what needed to be done. What do you mean by that?
Well, obviously, we got to see what kind of crime scene we have, what kind of evidence is there. Obviously, we're looking for blood, we're looking for weapons, we're looking for different things that could help us process or things we need to collect. So we want to identify items and areas that we need to put our focus on.
And you said at this point you have an upstairs crime scene and a downstairs crime scene.
Correct.
Was there someone that was sent to also help process the downstairs?
There was a CCBI agent, yes.
Okay.
A total separate agent.
Okay. After walking through and looking, observing what you've described, do you stay there on scene while they're processing it, or tell us what you're doing?
I do. I'm there obviously to help them. I don't do any of the processing, they do it. So my job is to assist them. My job is also to help look for evidence, and my job's to be able to use some of the items if we find some sort of evidence, to be able to relay it to my team that's at the police station and out with me that may help them in interviews or whatever they're doing at the time.
And are you in communication, for example, with the folks that are talking to Hannah and the construction
I am.
workers?
Yes, ma'am.
At some point, are you able to identify, you said initially you weren't even sure if you knew who the person was.
Correct.
And at what point did you realize that it was, in fact, Melissa Huggins-Jones?
I believe that came through Hannah and came through family at that point.
Do you know if she had family that was here locally or lived locally?
I knew later on that they weren't local and that I think some of them had even already been to the crime scene and then were taken to Atlantic Avenue.
And so, as I say, at some point, would you want to speak with the members of Melissa's family?
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am.
While the agents are processing, or you've talked about the upstairs, did you go downstairs for yourself to observe what you said they believed to be an additional crime scene?
I did walk through, yes, ma'am.
And can you describe generally what you noticed downstairs?
This was an apartment office. There wasn't a whole lot of furniture or anything in there. Layout is exactly the same. So when you walk in their front door, there was a glass table that was right there. There were keys spread about the table, which just was kind of odd. As you enter, same thing, the kitchenette into the kitchen area. To the left is the living room. There was some small furniture in there. If you go around the corner and go into the bedroom, which would be right under Hannah's, I believe there was a dresser or a roll-top desk or something that was in there. There was a couple things laid out about the floor. Same thing with the bathroom. The bathroom it seemed everything was normal in there. If you go back out through the living room, by the kitchen, into what would be underneath Melissa's bedroom was where the kind of office actually was. There was a couple of desks in there, and it appeared that there was things thrown about. It wasn't neat, something that would be out of the ordinary of a business office.
When you were walking through the downstairs apartment office, did you notice anything unusual, anything about the carpet?
It appeared to be freshly vacuumed. You could see the vacuum lines in the carpet. And as you looked at the carpet, appeared to be footprints in the carpet.
Earlier we heard from Detective Gibney and Falk about, at some point in that morning, RPD was made aware of some car break-ins. Do you recall how that came into play in terms of where you are at the scene?
I don't remember how it came in. I recall the information came to me that they were working car break-ins in the area.
And so was that, I guess, sort of almost a third crime scene?
Correct. There was a total different agent that worked their investigation.
And while you're there, are you in constant communication with, for example, the crime scene in the cars, the crime scene downstairs, and the one in Melissa's apartment, or?
I don't know if I would say constant, but there was, we talked throughout the day. If information came up that was helpful to each of us, obviously we would share it. I know that they were working that. Detective Neighbors was below me. So, at times, obviously, I would have to step out to speak with supervisors, to speak with witnesses or anybody that just happened to show up. If they needed, I'd step downstairs, and if I saw Detective Neighbors, I'd talk to them very briefly, see if there was anything, going on or any information to share.
You said that part of your role as the investigator with the police department is to assist CCBI with things that they're finding. You've talked about the way the inside of the apartments looked. On the outside, did you notice anything unusual, or at least in working with the CCBI agent?
Well, as we got out onto the balcony, the sliding glass door was open. I know that CCBI had notified that what appeared to be a blood smear or something downstairs on the balcony of the office. As CCBI began processing the railing of the victims, we found there's a dryer vent that comes out right next to the victims under what I think would be Hannah's room window. As they were dusting it, they found what appeared to be a shoe impression.
And do you know whether they made efforts to collect that actual dryer vent?
They did collect it. They removed it and collected it.
While this is all going on, that is the initial processing of the scene, is Melissa's body still in the scene when they're processing?
At that point, yes.
Okay. And at some point, is it removed?
It is.
Okay.
I made contact with the medical examiner's office. I have to ask for approval to remove the body. I gave them the facts of the case, and they authorized that. Then from that point, I made contact with Wake County, and they have people that come and remove the body, which will be taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy.
Before she was moved, or her body was moved, did you yourself try to make observations of the injuries that you could see visually?
As we did, you could see, obviously, if you looked at her face was what appeared to be smashed in. Her nose looked like it had been totally detached from her face. Teeth were missing. The teeth that were there appeared to not be in the proper place. There was puncture wounds about her head and neck. And as we were examining the body, we found teeth in the bed.
And where were they in conjunction where her body was?
The teeth?
Yes.
I think were around her hip area.
And is that information that you would pass along to the medical examiner's office?
Yes, ma'am.
How long would you say you and members of CCBI were there on scene that initial day?
Quite a long time, most of the day into the evening.
And it's when you had said earlier on, once you realized you had a potential crime scene, you had told the initial officer that no one could come in or out of the scene. Is there a procedure by which the police department actually documents anyone
Yes.
that's allowed into the scene?
There's an officer that stands by, would be just outside the crime scene. His job is to record everybody's name, code number, which is a lot of people think is a badge number, and time you're in and the time you're out. If I step outside, they clock me out. If I step back inside, they clock me in.
How long did you keep that area a crime scene?
It was several days, I believe.
And so every time you would go back, are you saying that you would have to log back in?
There should be somebody there logging us in, yes. Now, if we're just going in and out, if I'm just stepping to talk to somebody, a lot of times they won't clock me out. But if I'm leaving the area, they will clock me out.
And so you said you were there for a long time that first day. When you left that first day, was it still a secure crime scene?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that someone 24 hours a day watching
Correct.
the scene? Okay.
Yes, and there were several officers, I believe, just because of the scope in the area.
You talked about what you observed when you walked into both of those areas, and that CCBI is responsible for documenting the scene as you see it. Who would collect the evidence there at scene, for example, if you wanted something taken into evidence?
Most of the items would be collected by CCBI.
And at some point later on, let me ask it this way. When they collect the items, where do they go?
CCBI takes them back to their lab in case there's further tests or evaluations that they want to do on the information, and then it stays with them until they're complete, and then eventually it'll get sent from CCBI back to the Raleigh Police Department.
And during the course of either this first day or into the next day, did CCBI collect various items from the crime scene?
Yes, ma'am.
do you become aware of what they're collecting, or do you work with the agent itself to kind of figure out what items may need to be taken into evidence?
Both.
At the end of that first day, were you done with your involvement at the crime scene?
No, I went back to the Raleigh Police Department and met with the rest of the detectives in my unit and just did a quick briefing on what was going on, what they had been doing while I was at the crime scene.
When you come back, is that where you're sharing the information that you've all received?
Yes, ma'am.
And initially on, did you have any active suspect?
No, ma'am.
What did you do the next day?
Next day, return to the crime scene.
And what are you trying to do at this point?
We're just continuing our processing at that point.
And to be clear, when I asked about keeping the crime scenes, the apartments, both of them were crime scenes for several days?
Correct.
Does CCBI, you talked about taking some items back to the lab, do they do any processing on scene?
They do. There's obviously they look for fingerprints. They test and take collection of what appears to be blood. One, to see if it is blood, and then two, to be able to take that blood later and test it, see if it's the victim, see if it's suspects. They do. At one point, we did black light, where we tried to see if there was anything that could be found with that. We used a procedure to see if maybe blood was somewhere and had been removed or washed away. They have a process of doing that. DNA samples, we took what's called trace tape, where they take tape and pat it down on certain areas to try to find fibers or anything that could come from somebody. We took samples of just about anything possible we could.
And you had described the carpet downstairs. Was there efforts to document what you might have seen there?
Yes, they cut the carpet, well, they took pictures of it, and then I believe they cut portions of the carpet out that look like foot impressions to be able to be taken, and then they can make, I believe, a cast of that shoe impression.
And you had talked about getting approval from the medical examiner's office to remove the body. What happens, and where did Melissa's body go?
Melissa's body went to the medical examiner's office itself for an autopsy.
And do you recall when the autopsy was?
The autopsy, I believe, was on the next, that was on 5/15. I got called and advised by the medical examiner's office that the autopsy would be happening in about 30 minutes, and that was on the morning of the 15th.
Did you attend the autopsy?
I did not.
Okay. And would someone from your team then go?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recall who went?
Detective Morse.
At the time, earlier Detective Morse had identified that a sexual assault examination kit was done.
Yes.
Whose decision was that?
That was mine.
And why did you decide to do that? And we call it a sexual assault kit, but is it a rape kit?
It is, yes.
At that point, why did you make the decision to do that?
At that point, we had no suspects at this time. We weren't aware of how Melissa had died or what happened. So just out of abundance of caution, we decided to do a rape kit just in case there was something that happened before. We also take what's called nail clippings. We have them clip the fingernails because obviously if she's fighting with somebody, she may scratch, which gets their DNA underneath the fingernails.
And at this point, to your knowledge, are officers still working the car break-ins and those types of angles?
To the best of my knowledge, they were.
In addition to interviewing the folks that you said on the first day, were you making efforts to see if there was any sort of documentation in terms of surveillance that might help you out?
In types of surveillance?
Yeah, like
looking
for surveillance.
I know that there were people that were riding around the area looking for video cameras, looking for anything that may help us.
At some point, were you made aware of whether or not there had been any police activity in the area of Alistair and what we've been talking about around the time frames that you at least thought might be in connection with it?
At some point I was told that there was some suspicious people or some car break-ins from the night before.
And at some point did you follow up with that?
Some officers did, or
Yeah.
other detectives did. I didn't personally.
You described the agents from CCBI collecting samples of what they thought were blood at the scene, and now that the autopsy is done and the rape kit was done, did you make a request early on for the SBI to assist you?
I did.
And can you tell us what the SBI can do, or why you made a request of them?
Made a request for them because just for that, we had no leads at that point. So we were trying to see if the blood samples that we had collected may show maybe a possible suspect. So the blood was requested, the sexual assault kit, the nail clippings were requested of SBI to get what's called a rush, where they could evaluate it right away to see if they could identify any DNA that would be there that may help us identify a suspect.
And the items that you described, the samples and the kit itself, do you know how that got to the SBI?
I believe Detective Morse took it.
And was that next day?
I believe so, yes, ma'am.
Again, do you recall sort of, now we're on May 15th, how long you might have been out? Did you stay out at the scene the whole day?
I did.
Okay. And were you helping the CCBI agents in their processing?
I was.
Do you recall about how long that day was?
It was through that day, too.
Okay. Now at the conclusion of the second day, the 15th of May, had you any real leads or suspects at that point?
No, ma'am.
And if folks would call into the police department and say they had information, would someone follow up with them?
Oh, absolutely.
For all calls?
For all calls.
And to your knowledge, were there folks calling to give information or things they thought might be helpful?
I know there was friends, family, there was calls coming in through our Crime Stoppers. Everything was being somebody was getting in contact with them and interviewing them.
And what is Crime Stoppers?
Crime Stoppers can be used either as an anonymous number, or you can volunteer your information if you want. It's a national number. You can give a call and you can volunteer information that you have on crimes. You don't have to leave your phone number. You don't have to leave your name. And it's kind of like a tip line.
Would someone from either your unit or the other investigators follow up on each and every call that came in?
Oh, absolutely.
Did you yourself speak with some of the folks that would call in with information?
I did.
When you said that there were some things that the CCBI would do there on scene, that is the fingerprinting and maybe looking with light sources and those types of things, afterwards, do you know whether or not they were processing any other items there at the lab that you referred to?
I know that some of the items were taken back, and I think some of the bed sheets and different things like that, they were doing some testing on it for the lab, seeing if there was anything further that they missed or could collect or do further investigation on.
Would they call you and let you know whether or not they had any information to share, like if they found something that's helpful?
They did. At one point, I was there with them during some of it, but I couldn't be there, obviously, with an active investigation of stuff that's going on the whole time. So
we've heard a lot over the course of a week about the 2 Lenovo laptops that were taken. What efforts were you all doing at the police department to try and see if they could help you identify or give you some information? At
the police department?
Yeah, I mean, what were the investigators doing?
I know that once they gathered what they thought were the identifying numbers from the computer, there was contact being made with anybody possible that could help us. I know I spoke with people from Intel, the old Intel Inside. I spoke with them, gave them all the information that we had to see if there was any way that they could say that that was our computer. I know at one point was speaking with somebody with their corporate security. They were not able to help us, but they advised us that we needed to contact Lenovo, that they should be able to help us. And I know that Detective Morse was working very hard on that while I was mostly at the crime scene.
And the folks at Kane Realty, were they trying to help you with the information that they may have about those laptops?
Kane Realty was doing everything they could to obtain the MAC addresses and the different things, information for us, giving us all the information possible.
Earlier, I think the construction workers and maybe Mr. Langley had indicated that you were collecting shoes.
I was.
Can you tell us why you did that?
Obviously, we had shoe impressions inside on the carpets, so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't them walking through. They're in there. There was the information where they were working on Melissa's air conditioning unit the day before. So we wanted to make sure that the shoe impressions we had weren't somebody allowed to be there. We also have firemen and EMS and police officers that come in and out as well. And at many times we take those kind of boots as well. But I know we took them from the maintenance men and a couple of the other people that were in the apartment.
And now were several days after the homicide. Had you still at that point had any real suspects or leads?
No, no, ma'am.
And you said that you were calling as many people as you could to try and assist with the location of the laptops. Did any of that bear out in terms of Lenovo or Intel being able to help you sort of remotely?
I know at one point Detective Morse advised me that he had spoken with people in Lenovo and that they had given a pretty positive response to that those were the computer or the computers that we had, that they would be able to identify them if we found them.
If we found them. But sort of in terms of like pinging a laptop or an app that would help you find them from your office, so to speak, were you able to do anything?
No, there was nothing at that point, no.
At some point, did Detective Morse tell you that he thought he might have found one of the laptops?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you recall where we are in the investigation at this point?
I think it was on the 20th.
So 6 days after her
Correct.
death. And what efforts did your unit make to try and determine whether or not the laptop he had seen was one of the ones taken?
He had advised that he had was on Craigslist and had seen a computer that just matched the color and the style of one that was missing. He then, in reviewing the pictures on the Craigslist, you could see identifying numbers in the pictures. He then took those identifying numbers, made contact with Lenovo, gave them those numbers and says, "Is this our computer?" And they were able to identify that that would be our computer.
And what efforts did you all make at that point to try and get your hands on it?
Detective Morse set up contacted the person, the Craigslist seller, and asked him to meet to buy the computer. I know that there was a setup time and a place, I think it was the Walmart in Wake Forest, that they were going to go up and buy the computer. The seller never showed.
And at that point, what did you all do after the no-show?
I know that Detective Morse continued to work. They used, I think, the phone number that was used in the ad. They started running that phone number and came up with the name of Michael McCullum.
Once you had a person that you believed to be involved with at least the trying to sell the computer, what efforts did you make to track that down?
I know that they were doing surveillance on the home, some of the different units. Detective Morse, seeing that the Lenovo people said that that would be the computer, he then took out a search warrant for Mr. McCullum's home, which was in Wake Forest, as well as obtained a warrant for possession of stolen property.
And did you yourself go out to the Wake Forest location?
I did.
Okay. And were you there when officers found the silver Lenovo laptop that was testified to earlier?
Yes, ma'am.
You want me to approach the witness?
Yes.
As I'm approaching with what is marked as State's Exhibit 25, Detective Ray, you said that there was surveillance that was done. Was Mr. McCullum home when the search warrant was executed?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 25, the contents of 25A, excuse me, ask if you recognize this.
I do.
And what is State's Exhibit, specifically 25A?
Appears to be the gray Lenovo that was in Mr. McCullum's bedroom.
And looking at the tag, can you tell for certain that it is?
It is.
And how do you know that?
Because that's the tag that we place, the evidence tag, after it's collected.
Do you know who collected this actually into evidence?
It would have been me.
Okay. And once you collected it, did you seal it and bring it back to the Raleigh Police Department?
I did.
And is this the exact computer you took from Mr. McCullum's residence?
It is.
Did you ask that any further testing be done on this computer?
No.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to introduce State's Exhibits 25 containing 25A.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right, it's allowed. And Ms. Shakita, we're going to stop right there and go ahead and take lunch recess till 2:30. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and be in lunch recess until 2:30. Please recall all the instructions that I've given you thus far, and if you'll leave your notepads in your chairs. Everyone else, please remain seated. outside the presence of the jury, I want to go back to this narration of the, sir, you may step in.
Thank you, sir.
Of the interview. I had the opportunity to go through it with more precise care, I think, in an effort to have a completely consistent ruling. So the way that I'm trying to draw a line with respect to what falls into Rule 403 and what does not, what constitutes permissible interrogation and can be the subject of a limiting instruction is, I think it's appropriate for the jury to understand that the investigator was indicating that other co-defendants were pointing the finger at this defendant and that they were, in a general sense, providing details. Where I draw the line is where the details themselves are described. And so, in that regard, on page 14, which we've already addressed, that bolded section would be allowed, and the limiting instruction I will give is that questions and information recounted within questions are not being received for the truth of what is being recounted, but solely for the purpose of putting the response of the defendant in context and as evidence of the interrogation methods employed by the detective. You must not consider the questions for the truth of what is being asked. Then we move to page 15, and all of that bolded section would be excluded. I believe that falls within details that would be excluded. Then we move to page 16, where I had previously said they've already told us, they've provided us with details that people would only know if they were told that or if they were there. Okay, do you understand what's going on right now? I'm telling you, you have two people that you were with that are accusing you of murder. Okay. I'm going to allow that testimony, and I'll give the same limiting instruction that I gave previously.
You start there again, Your Honor.
Well, essentially, it makes the entire bolded section on page 16 admissible. All right. Then moving on to page 22, my ruling on that, starting with the word Ron on the third line, I'm going to continue to exclude that, the remainder of the bolded section there. All right, so no changes to my ruling on that. Going to page 28, I'd already allowed all the way down to the word, do you understand what I'm saying? I'm going to allow further this statement that says Ron's putting it on you and you're putting it on Ron. So who's the liar? And then include the remainder of that. You can ask anyone I be around, I don't. The next line that says, well, Ron's given us details.
So just to be
Yes.
clear, so that means that none of that paragraph on the page, the second.
Right.
So that will all be.
All of page 28 would be allowed. But then starting on page 29, that very first sentence, and then his response, he's lying, would be excluded. But then it picks up where it says, I would allow, and you're kind of beating around the bush. All right.
All of that
Would be allowed.
So essentially just taking those two lines out.
Right, right. And then moving on to the last, page 33, there's no change to that one. The excluded portion starts with Detective Gibney saying, so why is he telling us? And it goes to, he's lying. So 7 lines. That would be excluded. But
Okay, pick back up at, okay.
pick up with okay. All right. All right, so I apologize for revisiting that issue, but I think that's, so again, I'm attempting to eliminate specific details that are provided in the narrative, but the fact that other co-defendants are pointing the finger or are talking, I think that's an appropriate investigative technique, and that the jury can receive that with a limiting instruction, and with that, it would not be unduly prejudicial when balanced against the probative value of the statements made.
And thank you for your consideration on that. The only, in that line of thinking, the only other issue that I wanted to raise was on page 15. What I would ask is, well, I've got Ron and Sarah telling us that you went up, that you broke into the apartments, and that you had a little issue when you got inside of one of them, and they provided us with some details. I understand that's out. But then starting up there, allowing that, okay, this is your opportunity to help. What is that? You don't know what you're looking at. We've already talked about this. Let all that in. Travion says, I mean. And then when Detective Gibney says they provided details of how you went into the apartment, all that, everything which matches what we found. Does that make sense to you? So basically right now, we've got the same people that were out there breaking into cars giving us details about how you broke into the apartment. I understand with your ruling that section is probably out, but then allowing us to start back at, and we've got the recovered stuff.
Right, yeah, that would actually be fine.
Okay, so I can take out those two paragraphs that I read to you, but allow the rest of the bold in.
Right, so starting with the word okay on the fourth line of the bolded section, you can include that language all the way down to the word they provided us details. That's where that would be excluded.
Okay, and then start back up.
And then start back up, and we've recovered stuff. All right. All right. Yes.
I think we've got it right. I just want to make sure we've got it right. So starting in the bolded, on the second okay, which is on line 4.
Right.
That's when it's the excluded portion begins.
No. Well, no. The excluded portion begins with the first okay.
Sorry.
Right. Included starts with the second. Okay.
Okay. And the included goes down to I mean.
Right.
And then we are excluded from they provided to into the apartment.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
All right. Anything further? I'll note your objections that you've previously raised, and they are noted and preserved for the record.
Oh, just one other question.
Yes.
Is your intention that every time, how many limiting instructions are you going to give it each time, or is it going to be just clarification?
What I would say would be appropriate is to do it at the first instance where a question includes that sort of information, and then remind them at the conclusion of the interview as well. I'd do it a second time there and just simply note the limiting instruction again.
And I suppose when it happens at that point, they will hit the pause button to allow you to go ahead and do the instructions.
Right. So that would be,
I have it written.
right. So I think, right, on page 14, so
That's where I have the policy.
somewhere right around where it says, well, we've just spoken with Ron and with Sarah, and basically they've given it up. Okay, if you stopped right there, that would be an appropriate place for me to go ahead and give a limiting instruction. All right. All right, anything else we need to take up before we recess for lunch?
No, sir, thank you. No, sir.
All right, 2:30.
Superior Court stands in recess till 2:30.